now.
Great. Okay, guys. So we're gonna review before. Let me screen share first. Before each class, we recap the last class, what we learned, and so we'll do that. Most of the last class was just an introduction, but we will talk about database and such. So I am going to go ahead and open up the code and the database. Okay. Okay, so the database, it's really important to understand the nature of this database. This database is basically a regulatory database. In the mid-'80s, Congress passed the NOTA Act, the National Organ Transplant Act, which made it mandatory for every center to give data in. And so everyone has to submit data on all the transplants they do in the United States every 6 months, and that data is collected for regulatory reasons to make sure everyone has acceptable outcomes. But we have also been using this for research. They've released it for research, and we use it for research. So that's what this database is. It's important to know because some things are very good, like survival or the fact that a transplant occurred, because it has to be, for regulation, it has to be submitted. So some things are really good, and other things are not so good. And that's part of the art, is understanding what each variable and which ones are good and which ones are usable. So the first thing that I want to do to sort of understand this data is to kind of get a sense of all of the variables, and that was the homework assignment. So the first thing I always do is I alphabetize the variables, because the variables are very important. And so we are alphabetizing the variables here, and we're supposed to go through all of them. We said that there are two types of variables. There's categorical and continuous, or string. Categoricals are like black and white, and continuous are scale, like creatinine, for example. And they each have a particular language. So we know that tabulate is going to be what we use for categoricals. And you can always abbreviate something as long as it's distinct. So tab, ABO, and sum for continuous things. Summarize, it stands for. And here we summarize age. So that was mentioned, and we also mentioned the idea of going on to the data browser and actually looking at the raw data, which is here, and also looking at the description of the data across at the label, and also at the properties. And then we also suggested that you look at the legend to look for things that are coded. So between the legend, data browser, tabulate, summarize, we're supposed to understand all these variables, which you can. Okay? So that's really where we were at last time. Now we are going to start to code. So, and we already kind of did start to code, because summarize and tab, they are forms of code. But now we're going to actually go through the lines of code. So does everyone have this class soft score, this text file? If not, you need to download it from the Baylor box.
Yeah.
And if you don't, I would suggest that you guys, you could, there is a way of raising your hand on this thing, because I know from my kids' Zoom classes, but you could just, visually raise your hands. Do you guys have this text box? Not yet. No, it looks like none of you.
So I can send it real fast. It is in the root folder. I'm gonna put it into that email thread so people
that would be perfect. Tara, why don't you just email it to them, and you guys can open it up.
Yeah.
And then go ahead and let me know when you guys get it. Okay, we'll kind of run it in parallel. So you guys open it up, and I will start talking about the first part of the code. So we the first thing that you need to do with any study is you need to think very carefully about your inclusion and exclusion criteria. Inclusion and exclusion criteria will define your study cohort, and it's really, really important. So you have to think about it carefully. The time period, what patients you want to exclude. You want to have, a modern kind of as homogeneous of a population as you can to study. And that's what we sought to do with SoftScore. The first thing that we wanted to do is we wanted to look at only those who got transplanted. You may remember from the last time we spoke, this database includes 300,000 patients right here, but that's all at the time of listing. Those who actually got transplanted, about 156,000. I want to remove those who are listed and not transplanted. And so the first line of code is this. It says drop if transplant date is equal to blank. So the period is what will be a blank. The transplant date, if we write and we look at the transplant date and we summarize the transplant date, there's a date for everyone who got transplanted. So we're saying that if they didn't get a transplant, it would be blank. And to drop it if it is equal to blank. The double equal sign is the language, and you have to understand the language. It's not an easy thing, but generally there's a double equal sign if it's a variable that's already there. But if you create one, then you use a single equal sign. So double for one that's already created, and single for a variable that you're creating. So transplant date is one of the stock variables. It's there. We're going to actually build variables too, you'll see. But transplant date's there in the database, so it's a double equal sign. Period is what it is for blank. And I told you, you may remember, and don't worry, this may seem like a lot of tedious stuff, but we go over it over and over again. So you guys will get it. You may not get it at first, but you will get it because it's just repetition. But there's a different language for continuous and a different language for categorical variables. For continuous, a blank is a period right here, just a period. For categorical, it's a double quotes, like an empty quotes. So there you see an example of two different languages for the different categories for categorical and continuous variables. The first line is drop if transplant date is equal to blank. And if you run it, you go drop if transplant. 123,000 have been dropped, you can see. And that leaves us patient code. I say some patient code I use because it's a unique identifier for each patient. 156,000. So now I have a group that only includes people who got transplanted. So that's my first drop. Now the drops that I use, the exclusions basically, and you're left with the inclusions. The exclusions have been carefully thought of. Oftentimes they are done to keep the methods appropriate for publication, but we've thought about these things. And if you're not adapting a previous study, you need to think about this carefully. So that's the first line of code. The second line of code is you drop if the age is less than 18, okay? Because we want to look at just adults. Pediatric liver transplant is a totally different beast. It's a totally different field. We want to focus just on adults. Again, to get a homogeneous population, you want to try to keep your confounding issues outside of your analysis. So I'm going to drop if age is less than 18. That's pretty self-explanatory. This is the language that we're writing. And that's the language that you'll learn to speak. It's not very hard. It just comes from repetition. Do you guys all have the code? You do?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So you could follow along, and you should follow along also. So you want to go ahead and open up the data and then do the first two lines of code. Ideally, you'd want to type the code, not just cut and paste, because I want you to get used to writing the code. But if you're falling behind, you can just cut and paste it. Okay? All right. So now we've dropped the kids. So already, just by handling this data, this is the entire experience in the United States. Just by handling this data, we have so much information. And that's kind of the reason why I say the magic really isn't handling the data, because handling the data is going to inform you about the data. So already we know in the entire US experience, 279,000 people got listed, 156,000 got transplanted. So that's a transplant rate of about 55%. So if I go, display is the calculator function, you may remember. Yeah, it's 55.9% transplant rate. I can't tell you how many transplant surgeons who are practicing don't know the transplant rate, but we know the transplant rate just from doing 2 lines of code. That's the number of people who got listed to actually getting transplanted. About 1 in 2, about 55%. We also learn from this line of code where we drop if age is less than 18, that only 16,000 out of 156,000 are kids. So you know already that vast majority of transplant is adults, and kids are done very uncommonly. So you already get this amount of rich data. You already get that from just 2 lines of code. And that, you can imagine if you do this for years in the field that you're actually going into, you can really start to get a lot of insight into data, which will inform your hypotheses in the future. So now I'm left with 139,000 patients. Have you guys got to 139? Does everyone have 139? Do you guys know how to use the hand raise function? Or, yeah, just, I know it's juvenile, I'm sorry, just the Zoom stuff, but if you could, because I'm going to do this, yeah, there's one from Caroline. If you could do a thumbs up or a hands raise, yes, good, perfect. So 139,000 patients. Now, the next line of code is the dates. The dates are really important because we've been transplanting since the mid-'80s till now, and there's been a lot of differences that has happened over the years, different eras. And so you want to look at a kind of a modern, contemporaneous era where the conclusions you draw will pertain or be relevant to today's practice. So I'm going to drop if the transplant date is less than 2002. The reason I chose March 1st, 2002 is because that's when there was a huge allocation shift using the MELD score, which you guys have all heard of, I'm sure. And that's usually connotates the modern era. And that's what we would use for many, many years. But now, from 2002 to now is almost 20 years. So that's a big period of time. So I find myself now just using the past decade. But the soft score was based on an earlier publication date where we use the modern era. But whatever the date, has to be done carefully and with thought. Now, you don't want to make the date too small because then you have less power because you have less people. And your analysis is less likely to yield significant results. But if it's too long, too big of a period, then you introduce confounding from previous eras, how things were done before. Now, if you look at this line of code, it's kind of written strangely. Like there's a D, parentheses, the day, then the month in a 3-letter abbreviation, and then the year. And that's the language. That's how dates are coded. So you have to learn that language. So this is basically saying drop if the transplant happened before that date, March 1st. $45,000 patients got dropped. So now, if you look at this piece of data, you say, okay, it started in the 80s, 20 years to about 2002, and another 20 years. So 2002 is kind of like the midpoint. But there was only 45,000 transplants in the first period and 95 transplants in the second period. So already you're getting an understanding that this is an accelerating process, right? The first had half of what the second. So it's an accelerating process. And I only highlight these things just to give you the sense of how much insight you get from just handling the data. Okay, the next thing we want to look at is we want to look at this variable pxstat. So if I go tab pxstat, hopefully you guys looked at this. And what this is status at the end of follow-up, okay? Which is a really important variable. A stands for alive, D dead, L lost to follow-up, and R retransplant. So that will tell you what the status is at the last point of follow-up of the patient. It's probably the most important variable. I want to drop if it's blank. So I want to drop if there isn't a code for this variable, since it's so important. And it's categorical, you can see, because it's A, D, L, and R. And so I have to use a double quotes instead of the period. Period was for continuous, double quotes are for categorical. Drop if patient status is equal to blank. You can see that there's only 71 observations that are deleted, which is minuscule compared to 94,000. And the only reason we do it is to keep the methods kind of airtight for the purity of the methods and for publishing. So that's why we drop that, even though it won't really have an impact on the analysis. And that's, again, one of the power of the sample code, is it has a lot of the stuff baked in, that you'll need, that the reviewers will want or ask for. Okay, so far, we have 94,000 patients that are only transplants, that are adults, that are done in the modern era, and that have follow-up. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Raise your hand or just start talking. No? Okay. The next thing is that there are two types of transplants, two types of donors, I should say. One is a brain dead donor, which is the vast majority of transplants, and the other is live donation. Live donation is very uncommonly done in liver transplant because there's a lot of risk to the donor, so it's not done very commonly. But I want to look at just brain dead donors because that's another like apples and orange type situation. So I want to drop all the live donors. And this is a really important thing here. Because if I look at this live donor variable, there's a bunch of numbers, and there's 3,600 entries for 94,000 patients. You'd think that this is a really poorly entered variable. You'd think that. But in fact, it's one of these variables where people code it if it happened, and they don't even code it, they leave it blank if it didn't happen, because it's such a pivotal, important thing. So if someone does a live donor, it's such a big thing that they're gonna report it because they get credit when it comes to their outcomes from regulatory reasons. So this is an assumption we make, but it is a sound assumption that if it's coded, it's there, and if it's not, if it's blank, you could assume that it wasn't. And that even though the entry completion rate is very poor, it's like less than 1/3%, even though, it's about 3%, it's about 4%. It is 4% entry completion rate usually is not usable variable, but in this case, the assumption is that if it happened, it's coded, and if it's blank, it didn't, and it's accurate, and we make that assumption. So to drop it, what we kind of use is double negative. We say, drop if live donor is not equal to blank. So here is the code. The little enye is not equal to blank. So, and the reason we're saying it is, this is a kind of a little bit of an idiosyncrasy of the code that we use as doublespeak, but we're using this doublespeak to basically say if there's any entry, just drop it, because we assume that it's blank if it's not. And that, again, is a safe assumption in this case. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Now, this is really a categorical variable because these 1, 2, 3, there are different types of live donor transplants. But, ideally, if it was accurate, it would be coded as a categorical where you would have to put double quotes. But there are kind of different errors that happen, and this is an example of such where even though it's categorical, it's actually coded as a continuous. I know that from trial and error because I tried to do it as a categorical, it didn't work. Then you realize that it is actually put in as a continuous, even though it is a categorical. And that's the reason we use a period. And there's, we drop basically anyone who has an entry completion into the transplant. The same concept exists for combined organ transplants: heart, liver, kidney, liver, intestinal liver, lung, liver, pancreas, liver. Such a big deal that if it happens, they're going to put it in, and if it doesn't, we don't see it. And so, if we look at these variables again, before I even really start messing with something, I always look at it. I tabulate it. I look at the variable, understand the variable, and that's what I'm doing here. And so you can see simultaneous. There's an entry if it happened 221 times. It's such an uncommon event. But if it didn't happen, they're not going to waste their time even coding it, because it's just, if you do something 1% of the time, you're only going to code it if you do it. And if you don't do it, you're not going to go through and code it. And so this is an example of that. And so we're using the same double negative speak, NA not equal to double quotes, which is not equal to blank. So if there's an entry, drop it. And so we go ahead and cut and paste all those. And then you can see what the, I'm just on call, so you guys hold on one second. Hi, Dr. Murthy. I'm teaching a class right now. Can I call you back, or is it urgent? At this point, we really have a homogeneous population, right? 83,000 patients. We have just adults, no combined organ transplants, no live donor transplants, only transplants. And that now we have a group that we can start to study. So the first step in any study is to think carefully about who you're going to exclude, and you're left with your inclusion. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Is everyone up to 83,000 patients? Thumbs up if you guys. Okay, good. Everyone's good. Okay, so that is the inclusion-exclusion criteria. Now we're going to go through making variables. Variables is really important because we don't do analyses on anything but the variables that we create for two reasons. One, it forces you to understand the stock variables, because you take the stock variable and you make your own variable. It forces you to understand it. And two, everything has to be a 0 or a 1 to do a proper analysis, to do a regression analysis, to do any sort of analysis. Everything needs to be a 0 or a 1. And a lot of the stock variables aren't. And this is a way of making sure everything is clean, 0 and a 1, and you understand the variables. So we create variables. So let me give you an example. We're going to go down to look at ABO math. So I tabulate this because it's a categorical, and we have those three. We have three of them, and we talked about looking at the legends. And remember, maybe you remember from last time, 1 is identical, 2 is compatible, 3 is incompatible. And I want to create variables for compatible and for incompatible, and make 1, which is identical, the reference. So I basically create variables. I can name them any way I want. So the first line is what I'm doing. I'm saying generate ABOI is equal to 1 if ABO mat is equal to 3. There's double quotes here. Now this 3 is actually put in as a categorical, even though it could be put in as a continuous. But again, that's the idiosyncrasies of the database. It's baked into the code, but you have to explore to understand that. But this is categorical, so I have quotes around it. And then if I tabulate, and I just made this variable, and I labeled it I, so I can remember it later as ABO incompatible. And I tabulate ABO I, and it comes out to be 1 is equal to 742, the same as 3 here, right? But I said generate this variable is equal to 1 if ABO mat is equal to 3. So that makes sense, 742. But as I told you before, everything has to be a 0 or a 1 for it to work. So this is not going to work because the blanks are blanks. They're not zeros and ones. So I do something called recode, ABOI, blank is the period, is equal to 0. And now we have a variable that is usable, and that's good. It's ABO incompatible. 1 are the patients who are ABO incompatible, and 0 is everybody else. Okay? I'm going to do the same thing for compatible but not identical. You guys know what compatible, not identical, like an O can give to an A, the A will accept the O, blood or organ, but they're not identical. And so that's what we call compatible. And so here I'm going to go ahead and copy it. And then we'll go ahead and do the same thing, look at it. And it's 5,000, right? It's that number 2 here. And then I'm going to recode ABOC and then tab, and there you go. That's the variable. Everything's a 1 for ABO compatible and 0 for everyone else. And so I've just generated 2 variables. And you could actually put the recode together, like here you can see I wrote these 2 lines of code and then I said recode both of them together as 0 and equals to 1. So those are the first 2 variables that I've created. Now, you always check it when you make it, and everything should be a 1 or a 0. And you label it in a way that you can understand. And remember, if you don't, you can always go back to your code to see what it is. Okay, so that stuff's pretty straightforward. Is everyone following that?
Out of curiosity, is there a way to keep track of, like, does Stata keep track of variables that you've generated as opposed to the variables that were originally in the data set somewhere?
Yes, so, here I alphabetized it. So at the very bottom is going to be the variables that you create.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah. So, sorry, I'm just balancing these texts. Okay. All right, so that's that. Now we're going to go into making bins, or making a continuous range into categorical bins. Now, there's a couple of reasons that we do this. Like, if we're looking here, you guys read the soft score, so we're looking at death, right? We're looking at death 3 months after transplant. Would it make, as a clinician, and you guys are not clinicians yet, but you're starting, and would it make more sense for me to tell you that a 60-year-old patient has 20% greater risk of dying? Or would it make more clinical sense if I said every year of extra life adds 0.75% mortality, increased risk of mortality? We think of we want to bin stuff together. We want to think, okay, if they're over 75 or if they're younger than 20, that's how the clinical mind works. Another reason for doing this is that sometimes risk is not continuous. Sometimes risk is like a bell-shaped curve, right? It's or actually an inverse of a bell-shaped curve, where at the extremes there's greatest risk, and in the middle, in the mean, there's very little risk. A great example is death and age. Very young babies have a high rate of mortality, very young, and very old people have a high rate of mortality. And in the middle, not so much. So by creating these bins like 55 to 60 and 60 to 65 and greater than 65, different categories of ages, you can get a sense of that risk that's not evenly distributed. The next reason is it combines patients together in one group to give it power. More numbers, the more power you have, and the more likely to you're more likely you're able to uncover a significance based on that thing. So I don't know if that was clear, but it will be when you look at it here. So the first thing I want to do is I want to generate age between 18 and 30. And so 18 and 30 between 60 and 65 and greater than 65. 3 groups. And I've created those groups based on my clinical judgment. You can notice that this is the age of the recipient, the first one here. Down here is the age of the donor. The age of the donor has so many more, it's so much more granular, has so many more breakdowns, so many more bins. The reason for that is because I know from clinical experience that donor age has a greater impact than recipient age. Also, I know that from analysis. So that's why the recipient age has fewer variables while the donor age has a lot of different fine granular bins. So we're going to start off with the recipient age. Now the important thing to do, it says generate age is equal to 30 is equal to 1 if age is greater than or equal to 18, age is less than or equal to 30. It's very important that you do not have overlap between these variables. Everything has to be distinct. So the greater than and equal to sign or the greater than sign is really important. Like here, greater than equal to 60 and age less than 65. The next line, it's greater than or equal to 65. And I always put an upper limit on the variable. The reason for that is sometimes things are erroneously coded. Like it's supposed to be 32, but they put in an extra 3, so it's 323 or something like that. So you always put an upper limit. Now, everything needs to not have no overlap. Everything needs to be a 0 and a 1, and everything needs to be tested and checked. So by the definition of creating these variables, I've actually made a reference range because we're saying that we're creating these variables as risk factors. If there is not a risk factor for something, that by definition is the reference range. So what do you guys think the reference range is for this set of code?
The between 30 and 60.
Right, exactly. And that was also set. That was also set by clinical judgment, understanding. So a lot of the code will have this stuff baked in, as I said, or if you have a project, and Tara can speak to this, the variables is the art and the most important thing, and has to be created well. And oftentimes I'll sit with you and we will come up with a list of variables before we actually do the analysis. Isn't that right, Tara? You can speak to that with your discard risk index, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, we went through sort of 2 rounds of creating variables, and we adjusted. We realized, so I was working with kids, right? And so originally I used like the weight variable that's in Stata, or I was using the BMI variable, but then we actually changed that out to weight and height after we like reviewed the data and used Dr. Rana's clinical judgment. So yeah, but Dr. Rana really guides you through, and then you're off to a running start after that.
Okay, so we're going to create this variable. So I create a variable, I check it, especially when you're starting out. So 3,300 has an age between 18 and 30. Again, I label this whatever label I want for me to remember it. But between 18 and 30, 3,300. Not that many, but it's interesting. But notice this is just a 1, right? I cannot leave it. Everything has to be 1 and a 0. Go in and I create my other things. And I'm very careful here not to have any low overlap between the 65, these 2 groups, between age 65 and age 66. One is a greater than, the other one is a greater than or equal to. Absolutely no overlap. And an upper limit for the age to knock out the erroneous ones. Because if you take all the erroneous and you put it into your most extreme risk factor, it can be very much a confounder, because most of the erroneous ones are going to be whatever, 30, 40, 50 that get an extra number added to it. And you're taking all of those and you're adding it to the end. Okay, I need to answer this. Hello, sorry. That is how we're going to create these things. And then here, I'm going to go ahead and do those 2. And then we can combine all of them and recode everything so it's a 1 or a 0. And you look at them, tab age 30, tab age 65, tab age 66, and use 15,000, 11,000, 3,000. Those are our variables. We define our reference group by what we leave out. And you could also make sure that there's no overlap by tabulating them in a kind of a 2x2 chart, and you should have 0 when it comes to both of them, right? The 1 and the 1 should be a 0. So you could make sure that there's no overlap. See, 0 there. So this is a good variable. Everything we see is a 0 or a 1. We have defined bins. We define a reference group. Everything's ready to go. Does anyone have any questions?
I have a question. Maybe you'll get to it later, but what is the logistic fail lines?
Yes, I definitely will get to that later. That is regression. And the way the code is, we put them together, but right now we're just creating the variables. I also skipped over this area too. You made the fail. This whole thing I skipped over, and then I've skipped over regression. So this is going to be tomorrow's lecture, or I guess, yeah, tomorrow's lecture is going to be this, and then the last lecture is going to be this.
All right.
So that, it's a couple lines of code, but it takes a little bit of explaining. So I've created my variables, and there you go. Now here we go with donor age. And as I said, clinically, I know it's more impactful, so we're going to have to look over everything very carefully. So we're looking at this set here, and we made it very granular. Make sure there's no overlap. And what do you guys think the reference range is for this group?
30 to 45.
What's that?
30 to 45.
Yes, 30 to 45. I code for factors, risk factors or protective factors. I code, and everything I code for is a risk factor or a protective factor, a covariate, a factor. But what is left out is the reference range. So that's the reference range. You note here, you have a greater than or equal to. Here's a less than. This has to be greater than or equal to. No overlap. Nothing can overlap. Now you guys can realize the importance of code. I'm sorry, I'm getting, these are all organ offers that I'm getting. And I'm handling. These are all liver offers, actually. So I'm not technically on call, but my partners are in the OR. So I am handling their calls. And it's amazing, I could do everything on my phone now. Because this is kind of a real life application. We can talk about it. So here I have, this is, I won't give any kind of HIPAA qualifiers, but this is and I'll keep this de-identified, but a 26-year-old from Alabama who had a drug overdose. Have the age of the donor, have the weight and height. I have all of the LFTs, and then I have a match list. And the match list, my patient is number 3 on that list. So the first 2 will have to code out, or for whatever reason, the size would be wrong, or the patients are too sick for me to get that. So it's obviously a great donor, and I've accepted it, but I'm 3 on the list. So there'll be 2 more to go through. So anyways, that was that. And I'm fielding those calls. But anyhow, so I've created all these variables. I'm going to check them. And then the power of this code is I could just cut and paste, all these variables, right? You have all this sample code. It takes 2 minutes, and you have everything. Not even 2 minutes. I'm sorry, like 5 seconds, and you have everything ready to go. And you want to check them, make sure you can check them all. Make sure that the variables look good and everything's a 1 and a 0, and then you can make sure there's no overlap. Because anything, if there's not a 0 and 1, or there's overlap, it's going to throw off your analysis. And it's just like computer code. One line is off, then the whole thing doesn't work. The thing about this code is it has been vetted. So, usually it works. But there are cases where you get more recent databases that have variables that change, and sometimes you need to edit the code as well. Okay, so then that is how we are generating variables, right? In categorical bins. We can create another bin here of albumin. Now, usually we have the reference group in the middle, but sometimes the reference group can be in the beginning or the end of a range. So here is albumin, and you guys know albumin is a very important marker for nutrition. What do you guys think the reference range is here?
Is it albumin above 2.5?
Yes, that's correct. Because we're looking for malnutrition. Malnutrition is albumin less than 2.5. So anything above, we can make your reference range anything in the middle, usually in the middle, in the beginning, or the end. And so this is an example where above 2.5 is a reference, and then below is becoming more and more severe forms of malnutrition. And so, again, same principles. I don't have any overlap, so less than equal to, greater than, less than equal to, greater than, and then also, to be complete, I would say greater than, less than 1.5 and greater than 0 to use the same principle. Let me just do that so that I'm serving as a good example. Okay, so then there you go. Runs, you have your variables. Okay, so you check them all, make sure there's no overlap, but we're not going to do that for the interest of time. Okay, and so that was an example of a reference that was on the higher range, was 2.5 and above was a reference. Now this is BMI, so what do you guys think the reference is here?
Low BMI, below what, 30, I guess?
Yeah, below 30. So that's the example of a reference range on the underside, because we're looking for obesity. So, and there are some people who would do malnutrition for a BMI less than 15 or 20 or something like that. You could do that as well, and you could this stuff is based on my trial and error with the analysis as well as my clinical background. So those two things, but you don't have to. You can manipulate or adapt, and we do that all the time. And it's legitimate to do that. You're justified to do that. You just are looking for the best. The model that you create is what justifies. You could do the creation of the variables and what you put in and all that stuff. You have some license to do as long as you can justify it. So that's BMI. This is cold ischemia time. Okay, this will be the last one here. So, what do you guys think the reference group is for this?
Six to 12 hours.
Yes, exactly. 6 to 12 hours. Correct. And again, same idea. No overlap. So greater than, equal to, greater than, and then put an upper cap on it.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is the upper cap just a random number, or is that some number you just thought would be a good one?
I mean, 100 is too long. Probably 50. It just has to be something on what you think is the upper range of what is reasonable.
Okay.
Because you don't want coding mistakes to show up in this.
Mm-hmm.
In this last, which is my most extreme variable, which will have a lot of impact and few patients. So even if you have even a relatively small number of mistaken coded patients in that group, it could throw things off. Okay. All right. And so then you create all these variables. And again, the code is easy. I mean, we're already through half of the soft code already. In fact, I could probably finish this whole code, you know, in another class. So it doesn't take long, but it's the variables, creating the variables, making the ranges, binning them correctly. That's the art. And that's where the effort is. Not the actual analysis in the code is simple. It's like, you know, not it's like 3-4 lines, but it's the actual variables. So, and we go on to do sodium, Karnofsky scores, which are functional, INR, life support, ICU, bunch of things, previous transplant, geographic region, bilirubin, warm ischemia time, all of these things. And we just use the same principles of generating variables. Okay, does anyone have any questions so far?
So you mentioned putting comments in our code, like in the future. Where exactly would those, were you talking about in something like this, commenting with these variables, or what exactly would that look like?
Yeah, so I don't do that. I think that the commenting comment was maybe Tahir or maybe one of the residents, one of the other students, and they write. So I don't put comments because it will throw off the cut and paste. Not necessarily, but sometimes, like for example, they would go ahead and write ABO incompatible, compatible variable, you know, whatever you want, and you could like change the font, the size of it to not, or whatever, change it, and to change the color of it, you know.
Yeah.
And that becomes a note, and it won't, the computer won't pick it up because it's not written in the language, right? So like you did this, right? And then if you want to run all this line of code, it'll run everything, but then it won't recognize this, you know. So that would be an example of a note. Yes.
Yeah. So can I share my screen for a second, Dr. Rana?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Sure, go ahead.
All right. Yeah. I guess I want to boot Dr. Rana, and then I'll share my screen. Yeah. All right. Do y'all see my screen now? Do you see like the code that's on the screen and stuff? Right. Okay. Cool. So within Stata, so there's like multiple ways to like have your code saved, and there's the text file, and then something that another student taught me was, it's called a do file. So what you do is you go to in Stata, you go to file, you click new, you click do file, right? And then let's say you're gonna take Dr. Rana's code that he sent in that RTF format, and you like paste it in here. Now, what's nice is that Stata has this like built-in coding thing, and oh, is it paused? Sorry, hold on. Let me see if I can share this in a way that's okay. You guys see it again? You guys see my screen again? Sorry about that. So like, what's nice about this do file is that you can see that it's meant to be like a platform for people to like basically write their code in. It's color coded, so the commands are color coded, the quotations are color coded, the lines over here are as well. And then you can comment. So if you different languages have different ways of doing this. In Stata, it's the // like here's a comment. Okay, do you see that? Okay. And I'll show you. So there's some code that I'm actually working on right now, and I've taken this code from another student. This is from Teddy, and you can see that like there's comments here, and so as I'm reading the code, I'm able to understand like, oh, okay, this is what this is, this is what this is, so on and so forth. So doing the code in the do file will be the way you do your comments. Any questions about that? And then as far as making new do files, it's just file, new, do file. Okay. And when you run the code in the do file, it will ignore your comments. So it'll only run like bona fide code. And you can actually highlight parts of your code and go in the top right corner, and you can execute just those parts. Or if you don't highlight anything and you click execute, it'll execute everything. I don't really recommend executing everything at once, but that's an option. So that's all I have Sorry, Dr. Rana, to hijack things.
No. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it brings up an important point because I'm kind of like a dinosaur in a lot of ways. So I use text files, and I don't want to change. But, these guys do a lot of stuff that I don't do, and they do a lot of more cutting edge stuff. And you guys, you get the fundamentals, and you could do all sorts of things. I mean, we had people do. Elizabeth Godfrey can do statistics that I can't understand, so that's an example of that. So you could do files. I like this text files because it's easily transferable. I can put them up, and everyone has it on the computer. So that's why I've done it. But yeah, people do use the do files. So okay, is there any other questions? So we did variables today. So 1 is introduction, 2 is variables, 3 is Kaplan-Meier analysis, and 4 is regression and building an index. And that is the fundamentals. I want to add multiple imputation also, which is how you deal with missing variables. And then we're done with the technical aspects. And then we're going to have, a couple like practical things of how to write papers, and what to expect when you're submitting a paper, and we even have other kinds of things. We also will have a lecture by a statistician who will talk about, I think, Tara, we're going to have her talk about different types of regression as soon as we get done with this fundamentals of the class. Okay, so we're done for variables today. Tomorrow will be Kaplan-Meier, and maybe I could do regression also, do Kaplan-Meier and regression, and then the last class will be imputation, and then putting everything together. Okay, but we're working towards doing all the code for the soft score. Okay, any questions, guys? No? Okay, awesome. There's a chat. People left chats here, I see. Okay, there you go. Okay, good. Okay, Tar, if no one has any questions, you can stop recording, and then we can go ahead